In times when Mr. Harvey was too ill to record his broadcasts, he turned that task over to the creator and sole writer of the rest of the story, his son. Here's Paul Harvey Arant, Jr.
Now, the rest of the story. Sid was barely 18, year and a half of school under his belt, and there was about one job in the entire city of New York for which he was perfectly qualified, dishwasher. So, Sid was a dishwasher. It was an ideal occupation in other ways. For instance, meals were free. Sid would work one restaurant one day, then return to the employment office for placement in another restaurant. Eventually, Sid tired of his professional transience and decided to get a steady dishwashing job, so he picked up a newspaper and turned to the want ads. There were plenty of jobs for unskilled workers, including dishwashers, but on the page opposite Dishwashers Wanted, there was an ad which had been placed by a small theater. Actors wanted. Actors. Now, Sid had always enjoyed the movies, had been inspired to become a cowboy through what he had seen on the screen not many years before, but the thought of actually working as an actor had not occurred to Sid until now. So he went down to that little theater, spoke to the manager about the ad, and the manager said he would give Sid a try. "You're an actor?" the gentleman asked. Sid said indeed he was an actor. So he was given a script and sent up to the empty stage and instructed to read from page 13. Well, of course, you know that Sid had never opened a script before in his life. Quite in fact, and because of his meager education, Sid could barely read at all. So after a few interminable moments of stumbling over the simplest of words, he heard the manager slam down the script from the darkness beyond the footlights. An angry voice followed. "Did you have to come in here and waste my time like this?" Then the manager walked up on stage and took Sid by the scruff of the neck, and as he was throwing the frightened boy out the door, he offered these words in parting: "Why don't you get a job as a dishwasher?" Well, Sid did return to dishwashing. But after he had earned enough money, he went back to the little theater from which he had been so rudely ejected, and humbly he asked if he might pay for acting lessons. Okay, first he would have to audition for drama class. So Sid memorized 2 paragraphs from True Confession magazine, auditioned with those, and was eventually admitted only because there were too few boys in the class to begin with. Yet regardless of the imbalanced quota, Sid, barely literate, evidently inarticulate, was expelled from the class after 3 months. Now he was a 2-time failure, an undereducated dishwasher bitten by the acting bug. But the only way now he could stay close to his dreams was to take a job at that little theater as an after-hours janitor. And he might have kept that job for the rest of his life, except for one thing. Sid's virtual illiteracy concealed the fact that he really was talented. And because that talent was ultimately recognized, the world has forgotten what you've just heard. Because Sid, the teenage boy qualified only to wash dishes, the unskilled laborer who just happened to notice a newspaper ad for the American Negro Theater, the inarticulate aspiring actor twice rejected by that company, he became Sidney Poitier, whom everyone would agree became one of America's most articulate actors. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Sidney Poitier was from a poor family. His parents, Reginald and Evelyn, were farmers who owned a farm on Cat Island in the Bahamas. Now, Cat Island was a British crown colony at the time. Reginald and Evelyn often traveled to Miami by boat to sell their produce to wholesalers. They made one of those boat trips to Miami in February 1927 when Evelyn was 7 months pregnant. Now, they planned to only be in Miami for a few days, so there was no need to be concerned about her being pregnant. But life usually doesn't go according to plan. Evelyn went into labor. On February 20th, 1927, Sidney Poitier was born 2 months prematurely. Because he was born in Miami, Florida, he was entitled to U.S. citizenship, but the doctor and nurses doubted that the child would survive. His father purchased a tiny casket, and his mother visited a palm reader. The palm reader told Sidney's mother, "Don't worry, the child will survive." His parents remained in Miami as little Sidney overcame one hurdle after another until 3 months later he was well enough to leave the hospital. The family soon returned to their farm on Cat Island. When Sidney was 10 years old, the family moved to Nassau, where Sidney first experienced electricity, plumbing, refrigeration. It was where he saw his first automobile and his first motion picture. Sidney began to get into trouble. When he was 15 years old, Sidney and 4 of his friends went to a cornfield. They plucked a bag full of corn from the stalks, went deep into the woods, built a fire, and roasted and ate the stolen corn. Sidney remembered that it was great. Soon thereafter, Sidney and his friends were arrested for the theft of corn. Sidney's father was angry when he went to the police station to see Sidney and learned that he had to pay for the corn and to pay a hefty fine on the spot or Sidney would go to jail. In an interview, Sidney explained that to get the money quickly, his father had to go to places he ordinarily wouldn't have gone. On the way home, Sidney's father told him, "You know, I've got to get you out of this country." He spent $3 to get Sidney a passport, and his mom spent a couple of dollars to buy Sidney 2 new shirts. 15-year-old Sidney got on a boat and went to live with his older brother in Miami. And for 8 years, Sidney had no contact with his parents. In Miami, Sidney struggled to adjust to the racism of the segregated South. Within a year, he took a bus to New York City. He arrived with no family, no friends, no relations of any kind. He had no address. He knew no one. He got off the bus at Broadway. Sidney explained that he was instantly transfixed by the theater lights, the traffic, and the hordes of people. He walked back and forth along the 8 blocks from Times Square to 50th Street eating hot dogs and drinking malted milk. Within a few short hours, he had spent all of the money he had, $3. Now remember, Sidney was just 15 years old. Now he had no money, knew no one. He could barely read, and he had a thick Bahamian accent. The deck was stacked against him. In the window of one of the buildings along his walk, he saw a sign advertising for a relief dishwasher. He immediately went in and got the job, which paid $4 cash each night, and he got 3 free meals per day. After his first shift, Sidney needed a place to sleep, but he was much more careful with his money this time around. He took his $4 and walked back to the bus station. Now at the time, the bus station had paid toilets. It cost a nickel to use the toilet. Sidney spent 5 cents to get into the toilet, sat on the seat, and propped his feet up on the door. He continued to sleep this way for a long time and lived in New York City on just a nickel a day. Can you imagine that? Shortly thereafter, he failed his first audition with the American Negro Theater, as Paul Jr. explained, because he struggled to read. He returned to dishwashing. One day, an elderly Jewish man he worked with handed him a newspaper and asked him, "What's new in the paper?" Sidney replied that he didn't know because he couldn't read too well. Every night after that place was closed and everyone had left, every night for several weeks, that elderly Jewish man sat with Sidney and taught him how to read. In November 1943, Sidney lied about his age and joined the Army. Sidney was trained to work with psychiatric patients, but he was angered at the way his superiors at the hospitals treated the patients. It was here that his desire to act came in handy. It may have been his finest performance. Sidney faked mental illness and in December 1944 was granted a Section 8 discharge. Now, a Section 8 was a category of discharge used by the U.S. military for soldiers who were deemed mentally unfit for service. Now, mentally unfit under Section 8 also included cross-dressers, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender military personnel. Wow. Earlier, I said that Sidney left Nassau at 15, moved to Miami, and lost touch with his parents for 8 years. By the time he reconnected with his parents, he was working in films. A lot of people knew his name by that point. In 1964, Sidney won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his role in Lilies of the Field. He was the first black male to win an Academy Award for Best Actor. Now that was 1964. It was nearly 4 decades later, in 2002, when the second black male won an Academy Award for Best Actor. Sidney appeared as Virgil Tibbs. You know this line. They call me Mr. Tibbs. In the 1967 film, In the Heat of the Night. While reading the script, Sidney said he would only do the film if they made one script change. When white plantation owner Eric Endicott slaps Tibbs for questioning him, Sidney said he was going to slap back. To be sure the studio went through with their promise, Sidney had it written into his contract that the film could never be shown in any theater, anywhere, unless he slapped back. The slap scene is one of the most memorable moments in the film and of Sidney's career. It's one of the most memorable shots in film history for its deeper meaning. The slap scene is the first instance of an African American character in a studio film physically standing up to racism without the character being punished or killed. Sidney Poitier appeared in nearly 60 films in his more than 5 decades in the film industry. He won numerous awards for acting. He was granted an honorary knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II. Remember, Cat Island was a British colony at the time. Some would say that Sidney achieved the American dream. Sidney Poitier went from the lowest depths of poverty to the height of prosperity. He went from being practically illiterate to becoming one of the best speakers in the industry. And it was all due to one thing. Not luck, determination. He became a hero to black people, to white people, and to me. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.